Young adult fiction is a frustratingly divisive thing. And unfortunately, I have participated in that divide myself. I've talked openly about the fact that YA fiction isn't for me because I'm not a young adult, I'm an adult. But even phrasing it as politely as possible, there's still an air of condescension in it, where so many of us consider YA fiction to just be not as good as adult fiction, not as smart or as literary or as competent or as well written. I myself have been guilty of thinking that way, and over the past few weeks and months I have been course correcting, reading lots of really great YA fiction that has helped change my mind immensely. I now am a huge fan of YA fiction regardless of genre. And so what I have here for you are 5 YA novels that I have read recently that changed my mind completely, had me falling in love with young adult fiction, and each of these is of a different genre and serves a different purpose. I have selected these 5 specifically because I read them all recently. They're all of different genres. They're all very modern and were published in the last few years, and so hopefully they're things that you won't expect. I could talk about The Hunger Games, which is a series that I am slowly remembering I really enjoyed back in the day. Or I could talk about His Dark Materials, the books that turned me into a bookworm when I was a young adult. Instead, I want to talk about these 5 modern young adult books. That said, I'd also like to give a quick spotlight to this, a 6th honourable mention. This is Anatomy, a Love Story by Dana Schwartz. The reason I'm not covering this in this video properly is because I've already done a video on it, in which I called this book Frankenstein if it was a romance. Anatomy is a young adult historic Gothic novel set in Edinburgh in the 19th century. It's a wonderfully exciting novel that I had a really great time reading, and I have the sequel lined up, so I'll be reading that soon. By the way, if you notice any clattering sounds, or if the camera suddenly topples over while I'm filming this, it's because of Mary Wollstonecraft. She's teething right now, she's going through some teenage years, and she's going half mental. Aren't you? She's basically like a bundle of knives right now. Also, just before I jump into the list, in case you missed it, I am now offering book editing services. You can click the link in the description that'll take you to my portfolio, and if you have a novel or a short story manuscript that you're hoping to self-publish or send to a publisher and you need someone to edit it, let me be your editor. Send it to me, I will proofread it, I will copy edit it, and I will make a lot of suggestions as to how your book could be refined and perfected, so that it's ready to self-publish or send to a publisher. If you are a writer and you need your works edited, send them my way. Again, the link is in the description. I am having so much fun editing books right now, and I would love to edit yours. Let's start with a book that people have gone absolutely nuts over. A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. I didn't know this book existed, and while I was doing some research into YA fiction, I came across it. It is staggering how much attention this book has gotten. It is now the first of a trilogy, but I wasn't sure if that meant that I wouldn't get a complete story when I read this. I took a chance and got it anyway, and it is a complete story. It just now has 2 sequels. A Good Girl's Guide to Murder is a young adult thriller set in a small town in the home counties of England. A very familiar place. I have lived and worked in towns just like this one. Towns where the teenagers are generally well behaved, pretty decent kids, and they spend a lot of time drinking and hosting and going to house parties. A Good Girl's Guide to Murder is set in the modern day, and our protagonist is an 18-year-old girl called Pippa. Pippa is hopefully bound for Cambridge University, but before she gets there, she has an extracurricular task that she needs to complete. And she has chosen for this task's topic an infamous local murder case from 5 years ago. 5 years ago, a teenage girl named Andy Bell disappeared and was presumed murdered. The reason people assume that she was murdered is because about 2 days after her disappearance, her boyfriend, Sal Singh, sent his family a text message confessing to the murder before taking his own life. The case was considered closed. He killed her, he then couldn't handle the guilt, and so he took his own life. But Pippa is not satisfied with that. She reopens this case as an amateur sleuth. She visits Sal's younger brother, and together the 2 of them try to investigate this all over again and find the real answers to this. Because Andy's body was never found. People only think she was murdered because he confessed, but is that enough? It doesn't feel right. And something I immediately appreciated as someone who doesn't like cops is that this novel paints the cops as incompetent. There's nothing aggressively ACAB about this book, but I enjoyed that in a very minor way. A Good Girl's Guide to Murder is written half in traditional prose and half in an epistolary style, as Pippa is writing down all of her case notes, and we also get things like transcripts and maps, interview tapes. That's what a transcript is. Lots and lots of notes that we can help piece together this puzzle. And it is amazingly satisfying. Honestly, this is one of the most thrilling thrillers I have ever read. Once again, before reading this, my learned distrust of YA books reared its head and I thought, thrillers are gritty, dark things. Is a YA thriller really going to be all that? Yes, it is. It is absolutely brilliant. It's wonderful. What really glues everything together is the character of Pippa herself. She is wonderfully sweet. I would argue that she could be read as autistic coded, but I'm never confident in saying things like that as a non-autistic person. But she is such an incredibly charming and charismatic character. I so enjoyed spending time with her and getting to know her and Ravi, Sal's little brother, as the novel went on. These are very endearing people. And as Pippa actually starts to build what looks like the skeleton of a case here, it is very, very Moorish. This book is over 400 pages long and I read it in 2 days. I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. I felt no reason to stop. I had to know what was going on, what the truth at the core of all of this is. Why everything seemed to be so lazily resolved 5 years ago when there's clearly so much else going on here. And as you learn more about the case and the truth of Andy's disappearance, you and Pippa also unravel so much more about this town and its people. The school she goes to, the friends that she has, the families of those friends, the teachers at her school. Everyone feels complicit in some way. There is an enormous web here to untangle if possible, or at least get yourself wrapped up in and just enjoy the ride. If you love thrillers, this is easily one of the most Moorish page-turners I have read in months, years maybe. I cannot wait to read the next one. Holly Jackson is a great writer of crime thrillers. Pippa is a wonderfully, delightfully charming protagonist. And the plot, as it unravels, is such a thrill ride. I cannot emphasize enough how much of a joy A Good Girl's Guide to Murder is. Then we have Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas. This is a queer novel, it is a romance novel, and it is an urban fantasy novel. It's a lot of things, and it juggles all of that really, really well. Cemetery Boys is set in Los Angeles in the modern day. Our protagonist, Yadriel, is a teenage boy, a transgender teenage boy, and his transness is very, very important to the story, because Yadriel is part of a Latin American family of brujas. Bruja women and brujo men, witches of a kind. Their family is tied to the dead. They live next to a church and graveyard. Everyone in their family is able to see and communicate with the dead. Ghosts roam around everywhere and they can see them. Brujo men are able to summon the dead. And brujas, the women, are able to use their witchy powers to heal people. As a trans boy, Yadriel wants to be a brujo. He is ready to take on the responsibilities of a man of their family. But the queerphobic and transphobic traditions of their family and their culture deny him that opportunity. His family are uncomfortable with him being trans, and they don't want him being a brujo. So he takes it into his own hands. Early in the novel, while he and his cousin are exploring the church after dark, they are suddenly hit with this psychic wave of pain and sadness. Every member of their family is immediately psychically aware that Yadriel's cousin Miguel has died. That's all they know. Miguel is dead. And so Yadriel tries to summon his spirit. And he succeeds. Kind of. He succeeds at summoning a spirit, but it's not Miguel. It's a local boy from his school called Julian, who also died the night before, very, very suddenly and mysteriously. Julian's an asshole. He skips class a lot, he's a rough kid, he's intimidating, he's potentially dangerous, but he is now dead. Yadriel has accidentally summoned him instead and has to fix that. And so we begin an investigation of sorts. Julian, for a start, needs to be at peace, because if spirits are not put to rest and sent to the afterlife, they turn nasty. They turn dark and evil and sinister. So there is a ticking clock here. But we also have to figure out what happened to Miguel. No body has been found, his spirit hasn't been found, and neither has Julian's body. Julian somehow died the night before. He remembers being jumped by someone, killed by someone, but his body hasn't been found. Other people are going missing, presumed dead. There is a conspiracy going on here. And in that sense, this is a mystery story. But as I said, it's also a romance. Because as they spend time together, Yadriel and Julian, or Julian's spirit, get very, very close. Julian reveals early on that he's in fact gay, and Yadriel can't deny that he kind of has feelings for him. As we go on, the mystery unfolds. Yadriel has to keep Julian's spirit secret, even though all of his family can see spirits, and so they're kind of latched onto each other. Going to school, discovering what's really going on here, and potentially maybe falling in love along the way. Maybe. Cemetery Boys is a lot of fun. The mystery is very enticing, there are moments of intense action, it's very, very funny in places, and it's incredibly sweet. Yadriel is a great protagonist. Blending Latin American traditions and folklore into a modern Los Angeles setting with a trans protagonist and a mix of urban fantasy and romance and mystery, it's all brilliant and it's so well done. It's a very nicely sized novel. You can read it in a few days and you'll feel satisfied by it. It's well paced. It is well executed. There really isn't a fault to this novel. It's not the most revelatory thing you'll ever read, but it is entirely well constructed, well plotted, and full of very likable characters and some decent humour. This is a speculative sci-fi novel by Joan He, The Ones We're Meant to Find. Joan He is a Chinese-American author, and this is her second novel. Her first was a fantasy novel called Descendant of the Crane, which I haven't read at this point. But The Ones We're Meant to Find really puts the speculative in speculative sci-fi. It's set in a future that is increasingly seeming very, very likely. The world is being ravaged by multiple natural disasters almost constantly, and 25% of our population live in these futuristic eco-cities that are suspended above the ground. The other 75% live on Earth in cities that are endangered. The way you end up in an ecosystem is kind of the reverse of how things work now in our capitalistic society. Right now, the more money you have, the more you exploit other people for financial gain, the more comfortable a life you get to live. But in this world, the more you can offer the world, the more you can use your skills and your knowledge to fix the world, the more likely you'll end up in an eco-city. That's kind of the rough setup, the rough world building, but there is a lot more to it. In fact, the world building in this is pretty dense. And yet, it's not really the main focus. The world, the sci-fi aspect, kind of takes a back seat to its characters. And there are two main protagonists, sisters. The first is Celia. We meet Celia on a beach on an island. She has been stranded on this deserted island for 3 years, and all she's been doing is trying to get off it, building rafts and boats that might get her off the island. But the funny thing is, she doesn't remember anything from before that. All she knows is life on this island. Her memories from before she arrived there are a complete mystery. She doesn't know why she's there or how she got there. The one thing she does know is that she has a sister. That sister's name, as far as she remembers, is Kay. She sometimes dreams of Kay, but she can't rely on those dreams. She doesn't know if they're memories or not. And so she has to trust that this knowledge of a sister that she'd like to return to is enough of a reason to get off the island, other than just getting off the island and getting out of her loneliness. And so for the first few chapters, we just watch her try and get off the island. She's charming. She has a little robot companion that is not of much use, but is kind of funny. And she lives in a cabin, and we don't know who built the cabin. It wasn't her. The cabin is full of stuff, full of clothes and things. There's a lot of mystery here as to what this island is, how she ended up there and why. And then we move over to her younger sister, Casey. Casey is living in an eco-city, and she is a young prodigy. Someone who might be able to save humanity. When we meet her, she's at a party and just wishing that Celia was there instead, because Casey's not good with people. She's the introvert, and Celia is the extrovert. And yet Celia's the one trapped alone on an island, and Casey's the one having to mingle with people. As that party chapter finishes up, one thing I really liked is that you find out that none of this was technically real. In this eco-city, in order to conserve energy, people spend a large percentage of their lives in stasis pods, and a projection of their consciousness is sent out to conserve energy. This projection doesn't need to eat, doesn't need to use water or food supplies. So a lot of the people walking around in these cities are actually holographic projections of the people asleep in the pods, their consciousness projected out into the world. And this whole party is made up of these consciousnesses. And you don't realise that at first, so I thought it was a great detail to sort of start off the novel with. Now, when we're on the island, it's been 3 years for Celia. But when we're in the city, it's only been 3 months since she's disappeared, so we're actually moving back in time a bit. And Casey doesn't know what happened to her sister. All she knows is that Celia disappeared. And I think that's all I'll tell you, because honestly, the more I talk, the more it feels like every single thing is a twist. Every chapter in this novel reveals one tiny extra bit of detail about the world, about these characters, about their situation. It really is a twisty-turny book. And yet it's also a really simple story about two sisters trying to reunite. That's the heart of it. That's the crux of it. It is speculative sci-fi. It is eco-sci-fi. But it's also a story of two sisters trying to get back together. It's a bit long. It drags, it can get really, really slow in places, it's certainly not perfect, but it's a very, very unique novel. I've not read anything like it before, and I had a good time with it. Now, if you're someone who religiously watches all of my videos, you'll probably know how nuts I am for this book. I have actually talked about this in a few videos at this point, but I will never pass up an excuse to revisit and rant about how amazing Iron Widow is. Iron Widow is a very, very exciting action sci-fi novel by Shiran J. Zhao, and it is an absolute masterpiece. The more that time goes by after having finished this book, the more I think it's one of my favourite novels of all time now. It is really amazing. Iron Widow is a loose retelling of the life of China's only female empress, Wu Zetian. But it is set in a futuristic science fiction world inspired by one of my favourite films, Guillermo del Toro's Pacific Rim. This is a book populated by giant mechs that are piloted by two people, just like in Pacific Rim. But this is a wonderfully feminist piece of science fiction. In this world inspired by Chinese history and culture, the pilots of these mechs are heroes, are famous, and their co-pilots, concubines, are always women who are little more than batteries that the male pilots use to fuel the mech. And so often the women who co-pilot these mechs end up dying. They really are like batteries that get used and then spat out and replaced. Our protagonist, Wu Zetian, knows that her sister was killed as a concubine and she wants revenge. And so she puts herself up to be a concubine for one of the great mech pilots. These mechs, by the way, are fighting strange, bug-like alien invaders beyond the Great Wall. They go out there, they fight a horde of them, and then they retire until the next battle. And Wu Zetian wants to be a concubine purely to get revenge. And that's exactly what she ends up doing. This is an amazingly feminist book, but it's also a book about class divides. A novel that really hones in on the tragic power of patriarchy and the way that patriarchy doesn't just screw over women, doesn't just screw over queer people, but patriarchy is also responsible for the oppression of people of different races and classes. And this book explores all of that so well. I'll stop talking here only because I've talked about this book a lot in the past, and I don't want to retread old ground. What I want to do instead is just reiterate that this is one of the best novels I have ever read in my life. Iron Widow is an absolute young adult science fiction masterpiece. And this is one of the novels that got me into YA fiction, or at least modern YA fiction. I said before that I love his start materials, I really enjoyed The Hunger Games, so I've never been unfamiliar with YA fiction. But when it comes to a lot of modern YA, I was very unfamiliar until I read the books of Andrew Joseph White. This is Hell Followed With Us, a book that once again I've already talked about before in another video. This is a post-apocalyptic queer horror novel. Our protagonist was raised in a doomsday cult, but not just a cult that believes in doomsday, but a cult that actually caused it. They actually ended the world using bioweapons. And now, like a zombie film or The Last of Us, streets of every city are plagued with monstrous, twisted, former people. And our protagonist, Benji, is a young trans guy. He was raised in this cult, and he was also raised to be their final weapon. He will eventually become some kind of a monster. He's been injected with something. He is a ticking time bomb. But when the novel begins, he has run away from this cult, and he will very soon find a group of young queer resistance fighters who are trying to take down the cult and undo the damage that they have done, at least in some small way, as best as they can, given the power they have. It's a found family story, it is a beautiful tale of camaraderie, it is a really twisted, nasty body horror thing, and it's a book about evangelical cults and the way that they have too much power and are able to ruin the world if they want to. It's a dark and bleak story, but it's also one that's full of hope and queer solidarity and, as I said, found families. It's absolutely beautiful. I am so amazed by the works of Andrew Joseph White. I really hope you enjoyed the sound of these 5 amazing young adult novels. They are all fantastic in their own right, but if you have to read only one, let it be Iron Widow. I will never shut up about how amazing that book is. Check these books out, and once again, if you're a writer and you want your works edited before they're published, or you just want someone to look over your manuscript and fix all the typos and tell you how it's going and what's good and what's bad about it, send it over to me. I love editing and I feel very privileged that I get to edit people's work, so send me yours and subscribe for books.